Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to continue our series of podcast episodes on important buildings and monuments around the nation. This week we're going to be looking at a home that is the home of our first president, George Washington. This week we're going to be talking about Mount Vernon.
Yes, and Ray, I can tell that as we have journeyed over the last several weeks and we've looked at the White House and the Capitol and recently the Washington Monument, that you get so edgy because you just really want to focus on the home of George Washington. Because our listeners, if they do not know by now, you are the groupie fan, admirer. I mean, all things Father George, it is Ray Shepherd. And you've been wanting to talk about this house for so long. So this is the episode in which we get to talk about the beautiful Mount Vernon, located in Virginia, overlooks the Potomac River, and might I say, has one of the most beautiful sunrises I have ever encountered in my life from the back stoop of the veranda.
Yeah, it's a very nice landscape there, a very nice house. And today we're just going to be looking at a little bit of its history because it, of course, had a history before George Washington got hold of it, and it's had a history since George Washington's death in December of 1799. And yes, this is an episode I have been looking forward to. I knew we were going to get to it at some point, but we had to go a few episodes in before we could look at it. So let's look at Mount Vernon. And I think the first thing we need to understand about Mount Vernon is when we look at it today, it's not, it's maybe not what some people might expect. When you think of the home of George Washington, this is where the first commander in chief, the first president of the United States, this is where this man lived. This is the structure he built. But, you go to it and it's not what I think some people would expect. It's in many ways, it is understated, I think.
Yeah, especially when people, and I think people look at architecture and you kind of architecture put into the place of today's, context, or you look at some of the buildings we've already talked about in previous podcasts and the grandeur and things like that. I mean, honestly, this was a house that was built in many stages, but if you go back to the very roots, it was like a hunting house.
Yeah.
It was actually called Little Hunting Creek Plantation. So, when it was first acquired, and that's the thing, you've got to, George Washington does a lot of renovations on Mount Vernon, but in its original beginning, it was simply a little Hunting Creek lodge, called a plantation, but it's not changed until a little bit later. And I think his half brother Lawrence isn't he the one that actually decides to change it from Little Hunting Creek to Mount Vernon?
Yeah, it is. And the thing about it is it's going to go through a number of hands, so to speak, before it gets to George Washington. The interesting thing about it is George Washington's really not, if you sit down and look at it, he's really not in the line to inherit this property at all. The property was owned by a guy called John Washington. It's going to go to, then I guess we could call him Lawrence Sr. This is not George Washington's half brother. This is a different Lawrence. And then it's going to go to his daughter, a woman named Mildred, who is the sister of Augustine Washington, who is George Washington's father. So it's going to belong to his aunt for a period of time. George Washington's father, Augustine Washington, is going to purchase Little Hunting Creek. And that's when it starts a little bit, you start having a little more construction going on there. And eventually it is going to go to Lawrence, who was Augustine's son with his previous wife. Augustine was married twice. His second wife was Mary Washington, and Lawrence is from his first marriage. So Lawrence and George Washington are not full brothers; they're half brothers. And of course, Lawrence is older than Washington than George Washington. So it's going to go to Lawrence. Lawrence, of course, is going to be a big influence in George's life. George Washington is going to look up to his older half brother. He's going to spend time at Mount Vernon as a younger person, visiting with his older brother, and the family there. Of course, ultimately, Lawrence is going to die relatively young. He's going to catch consumption or tuberculosis, and he is going to die. At that point, it then goes down through Lawrence's family. It's going to go down to his daughter and ultimately his wife. So it's going first, when Lawrence dies, it goes to his daughter. And then when his daughter dies, it goes to his widow. And then it ends up with George Washington, at least being owned by George Washington. George Washington really moved in long before, about 2 years before it actually was owned by him. But Lawrence died, leaving a massive hole in George Washington's life. This was a devastating blow for George Washington, and ultimately it would land in the hands of George Washington. But as you could tell from that sort of convoluted family tree, so to speak, of Mount Vernon, it wasn't a straight line.
It wasn't a straight line, but George Washington lived pretty much his early life in and around Mount Vernon. And that is where he really began the exploration of who he was and what he wanted to become. And I think because of where it was, agricultural was a big thing, and it led him to begin the process of trying to plant tobacco and creating somewhat of a farm. And as he began to become comfortable with that, he also was a surveyor of land. And so we started to see that, Washington was expanding the estate. He would purchase additional parcels of land, and, he would continue to add to the state. And, Washington's primary focus, which is hard to believe because we know him as, this famed military commander. We know him as, a superior political individual. But at the end of the day, Washington wanted to be an agriculturist. He wanted to be a farmer. He wanted to enjoy the land, and he used scientific approaches to farming. He kept meticulous records. And I think he was probably the happiest when he was farming, more so than on a battlefield or in Constitutional Hall or somewhere like that, dealing with, politics. And yet, even though he was the happiest, he struggled mightily in keeping Mount Vernon floating because, Ray, he wanted to be an agriculturist, but that didn't mean he was a great agriculturist.
No, and, later in his life, during the time, his latter years, he's going to refer to Mount Vernon as his vine and fig tree, sort of that place of rest, that place where he can go home to Martha and, do what, like you said, do what he really enjoyed doing. He enjoyed the farm. He enjoyed all the work that came with it. I mean, he had and we'll talk about some of the other people that were there a little later, but he had quite a staff there at Mount Vernon. It wasn't just him and Martha. And not only that, even when he was living there, again, this is later in his life, visitors were constantly coming in and out. And of course, he and Martha would always be good hosts and feed them and sometimes put them up for the night. So, it wasn't like it was this silent place where he could sit there by himself and contemplate. It was a very busy, busy place. But he still, like you said, looked forward to being there when he was president, looked forward to being there when he was commander in chief. That was his home. That was sort of his home base, his place of security. Now, he doesn't really move into Mount Vernon until 1759. And when he's initially there, he is paying rent to, I think it was Lawrence's widow, a lady called Anne. I think he is paying rent to her for the first 2 or 3 years. Then she dies in 1761. And that's when George Washington actually begins owning Mount Vernon. Of course, it is that's after he marries when Martha Dandridge Custis. Of course, we know her as Martha Washington, and they move in there, and that's where, of course, they're going to raise their family. And of course, George Washington never has children of his own, but he definitely adopts Martha's children as his own.
Yeah, and I'll kind of go back once again to that. It was a hustle and bustle of a place. You've got the kids that are roaming around. You've got the business people that are coming in because it is a place of business. Washington has the tobacco. But not only does he have tobacco, but he will experiment with cotton and with silk and with corn, and he's got cornmeal and flour. And I mean, there's like 60 different crops that he's working with over there. But Ray, it's just one of those great things for Washington in the fact of location. People talk about when they want to buy a house or build a house, it's all about three things: location, location, location. And so what's happening with this is he is there with the fertile soil, if you will. But Ray, right on the backside of the house is the Potomac River. So not only is he able to plant the crops, but he also establishes a small shipping fleet, which allows him to be able to take those crops and to send them to Philadelphia and to New York and to other places. But also that's how people also arrive. So he's kind of got the best of both worlds, because to be honest, during this time, traveling to Mount Vernon on horseback was an adventure. It was a very difficult journey. It was actually easier being able to come in on a boat. And so he was able to, help both sides of that.
Yeah, in Washington, we talked about Washington loving the farming aspect of Mount Vernon, even though he was never really what you would call rip-roaringly successful at it. When he was away during the war, when he was away during the presidency, he's constantly writing notes to his overseer or whoever he's got in charge there, and he's concerned about this, he's concerned about that, about the farm. So he's constantly throughout his life trying to keep the farm running, trying to find ways to make it productive, as you said. But he's also working on renovating it, and he also enjoys that renovation process. There's the quote about George Washington that says that he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen. Well, he was also, we talk about that, but he was also someone who loved decorating. He loved designing things. He loved renovating things. And you definitely see this in Mount Vernon. And he's going to, over time, increase the size of the Mount Vernon house to 2.5 stories. And again, it's still not this grand structure like what you might envision a government head in Europe having at this time. It was still comparatively a very humble abode, but it is a place that he's comfortable with, and he does extend the size of it to where it has 21 different rooms. The walls are made of wood, Chris, but they don't look like it, do they?
No, they absolutely do not. And, I encourage anyone who has the opportunity to take time and go and explore Mount Vernon. It's open to the public. It has, you can actually walk in the house and you can see the house as it was with during Washington's time. And the way it is so colorful. It is very colorful with the paintings and with other things, but the way that you can go up, the way that they did the nails, even in the hardboard on the outside, was made to be covered up, so like today, people will, do the nails so that they're finished nails. You can't see them, that they're covered up. He was painstakingly tedious when it came to the building of the house, but also of the way that he structured each room. I think he and Thomas Jefferson have a lot of similarities when it comes to Washington at Mount Vernon, Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, where they were both very elaborate in their designs, that they had a specific way that they wanted the house to be built because it served multiple purposes. It was a place to sleep, But more importantly, it was a place to entertain. It was a place to welcome people from all walks of life into the place, whether it be the indentured servants, it would be slaves, it would be business people, it would be war generals, so he wanted it to be a place that people never forgot.
Yeah, and it was a place that a lot of people wanted to go because of the man who was living there, George Washington. And even today, people who visit there go there because it was the home of George Washington. It was the home of Martha Washington. It was where they raised their family. But unfortunately, Chris, it was also the home to a good number of people who were not there voluntarily and who did not necessarily want to be there. And of course, we're talking about a large number of slaves. Washington is going to inherit his first slightly less than half dozen slaves, or actually slightly less than a dozen slaves, early in his life. But of course, his marriage to Martha Custis increases the number of slaves that he is responsible for. Now, of course, the Custis slaves, he doesn't really have the power to sell them or to free them because they are part of the estate, so to speak. But he does have control over these slaves. And so there's several hundred slaves out in Mount Vernon. I think overall, there was about 300 slaves working Mount Vernon and its surrounding farms. When we think about Mount Vernon, it wasn't just that one plantation house and the farm immediately around that plantation house. You had several farms spread out around it. And you had these slaves who were living and working in, Chris, what unfortunately we have to say was not always very good conditions on Mount Vernon and those surrounding farms.
We talked in a previous podcast a while back, I think, when we were speaking about the Declaration of Independence, and we kind of spoke about the struggle with what these founding fathers were dealing with when it came to slavery, and the fact that they were saying that we were going to be a nation that was free, but yet they had individuals working on their properties, including Mount Vernon, that were not free. And I appreciate, because it's easy for people who are lovers of George Washington and even Mount Vernon, the estate today, to kind of gloss over that, right? And just to say, yeah, it was a terrible time, move on. But I applaud Mount Vernon. If you go to Mount Vernon today, there is a museum that is there, and they have given specific attention to the struggles that Washington faced, but also the failures of Washington, knowing what he was trying to do with the country, and yet what he was unwilling to do on Mount Vernon, on the plantation. And, yes, Ray, you can speak more to this. He wrote in his will, before he died, he said, I want all my slaves to be emancipated upon my death. But Ray, as you've mentioned, the problem with that is that many of the slaves didn't belong to him. They belonged to his wife. And so, that was a problem. And basically, I think it was under the terms of the will that, those slaves would not be set free until Martha passed away. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yeah. In his will, he placed in there that the slaves that specifically belonged to him, not the Custis slaves, not the so-called dowry slaves, but the slaves that specifically belonged to him, would be freed upon the death of his wife. Well, she is actually going to free his slaves in 1801, much sooner than that. And the reason, and this is coming from Abigail Adams here, John Adams' wife, is that she became afraid of him, because apparently they had found out that, the only thing standing between me and freedom is that old woman over there. So maybe we can do something to sort of speed her home going on, as we could say. And there had been some incidents around the farm, around the plantation, that gave her pause. So in 1801, she does free the slaves that were owned outright by George Washington, but she does not free the Custis slaves. She couldn't have. But she doesn't even free her own slave. all of the slaves that Martha Washington had control over, when she dies, they go down through the family. They're inherited down in the will, just like, a chair or a rake might be. I mean, it was very, very unfortunate. And this is one of the things that caused one of the more unfortunate incidents in the life of George Washington, and that was Oni Judd. Oni Judd was a slave. She was Martha Washington's slave, specifically. She was one of the Custis slaves, I believe, but she learned when she was in Philadelphia while Washington was president that when Washington and Martha died, that she would be inherited by some of the descendants, and she didn't want that, and she ran away. And she's one of these slaves that ran away, and Washington and Martha were never able to recover her.
Yeah, and that's, there's so many facets of Washington's life and that come into play with this. And even after his death, especially as it relates to Mount Vernon, there's still so many different stories that Mount Vernon takes after, the death of Washington and his will. And, Ray, I spent a week at Mount Vernon working with the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, just kind of studying the history of Mount Vernon. And it was really cool. Got to experience a lot of different things, but it led me to two things I didn't know about Mount Vernon. And one was that when, Washington died, and then later on after Martha died, that the house was passed on to his nephew. Well, what I find to be fascinating about his nephew is that his name was Bushrod. And I just like that name, Bushrod Washington. There's just something, hey, old Bushrod, how are you? But what's also fascinating is that Bushrod Washington, the nephew of George Washington, was also an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So you could call him Associate Justice Bushrod Washington, which I just think is pretty cool.
When you think of someone that's going to go to law school and become a Supreme Court justice, Bushrod is not the name you usually think about.
Absolutely not. No, that's you think of him, getting on a bush hog and riding the pasture and cutting the grass. You just think of him being that agriculturist, right? You don't think that, but he actually goes to the Supreme Court. But the other thing that goes with that is that when Bushrod is, he dies, and there's some other people that are kind of in that lineage, but they go to the government and say, hey, how about you, Congress, buy the mansion and let it be part of history, let it be preserved as part of history. And Congress basically says, we don't care about the house that first president of the United States was a part of. And Congress actually turns it down, and he can't even get the Virginia General Assembly to do it. And that's what fascinated me when I met this group of individuals that were called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And I was blown away because, Ray, I just thought that Mount Vernon house was still in like some descendants of Washington, but it's not. This Mount Vernon ladies bought the house, and I think they paid like $200,000 for it, which is, I don't know what it is in today's society, but it's just fascinating. And by the way, these Mount Vernon ladies, they know anything and everything you would want to know about Mount Vernon, and they care about it, and they treat it like it is royalty. It is fitting for a king, which I think is interesting that it had to be these ladies that would do it when Congress refused to even give it a second thought.
Yeah, because by the time the Mount Vernon Ladies Association obtains Mount Vernon in 1858, the mansion has fallen into disrepair. It is not, it's not in the best of shape. And they have been, over the past 100 plus years, they have been working very hard, of course, not just simply to restore the mansion to what it looked like during George Washington's life, but also to bring back to the mansion furniture and other artifacts that either belonged to Washington himself or replicate things that were actually there when George Washington was there.
Yeah, and they're restoring it using the same tools,
Yeah.
the same material that was done back in the day. And Ray, you and I are history nerds, and we're just like geeks about this stuff. But can I just say that when I went and put my hand on one of those boards that was the original board of Mount Vernon, there's something powerful about that, because it is historical, and watching people construct things like they used to construct. We cannot lose the past. We cannot just simply say that's history, because history helps define who we are. And we cannot forget, and something as simple as a house or a monument, it transcends time, because when we walk those halls, it reminds us of people who sacrificed everything. George Washington spent a short amount of time at that house because he was out fighting for the country. He was out serving the country. He was out doing all of these different things. And so that is something that we must always remember, is that the house, not that George built, but the house where George lived, it speaks to us today about the power that comes in recognizing things of the past.
Yeah, and it is I think we as a society have been and continue to be a little too quick to bulldoze old buildings. Well, that building's old. We no longer want it to look like that, so let's just tear it down. And that is a very unfortunate thing that happens way too often in the name of progress. But Chris, there's not just, when we think about Mount Vernon, it's not just a house and all of that there. There's also graves there. There are specifically two tombs. Now, there are specifically two tombs. You have the original family tomb, which of course is referred to as the old tomb. And then eventually this new tomb was built, which Washington had provided for this new tomb to be built. And at that time, Washington and all of his family were moved there to the new tomb. And that's what you visit today when you go to Mount Vernon and you see the grave of George Washington and Martha Washington out there behind the gate. That's the new tomb.
Yeah, and it's just a beautiful place, and I think it's you can see it all. And so I encourage the Mount Vernon. If you go, there is a wonderful website on Mount Vernon, which gives you some of the resources we use this week and pictures, and you can go in depth at looking at all of the various aspects of it. They have he had a distillery where they're still making his old recipe. I think it's whiskey. They still make it there the way that he made it. Everything is still done the way that he did it. And so what a fascinating place. And Ray, I know you're a big fan, and we talked about tombs. Any ghost stories you want to share with us about Mount Vernon?
No ghost stories, but I think, I'm sure George Washington still walks the grounds. I mean, he's got to be looking over what's going on up there with, I would say, a little bit of pleasure. But you know what? Something about George Washington that we haven't discussed, and I know this is episode about the house and not Washington himself, but he was a hard person to work for. Whether you were under him in the military, whether you were an employee at Mount Vernon, whether you were a slave, he had a very high level of expectations, and he wanted things a certain way. So I'm sure if he's walking around the Mount Vernon farm today, he probably likes what he sees, I would hope.
Yeah, I think so, because it is a reminder to us that hard work, perseverance, sacrifice is what makes a home, but it also makes a nation.
Yeah. And usually, Chris, I do have a ghost story, but I didn't think about the ghost story today. So, I fell down on the job. What are we going to say?
Right. I thought this was a great episode. I appreciate you sharing your love of Mount Vernon. We encourage our listeners to take a few moments and go and visit our other podcasts that range from monuments and houses, but we've got some fascinating stories on North Carolina life, local life here in southeastern North Carolina, and just a variety of different things of history that you should know, but maybe you don't. And so join us on iHeartRadio, Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, wherever you find your podcast, you'll find us there. Like us on Facebook, other social media, and we look forward to coming to you again with another powerful, engaging podcast. And it's good to talk to you. Have a great day.